الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grants us tawfiq, success. He makes us of those who are guided and guided others. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He protects us from all forms of deviation, that which is apparent and that which is hidden. It's another session where we look at Aqeedah at-Tadmuriyyah, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. And we have reached at-Ta'ifa al-Rabi'. Over the last few lessons we'll be looking at what the Shaykh has to say about ta'til and tashbih. As for tashbih, we've looked at that. As for ta'til al-Mu'attala, he has given us four groups. The first one, the Asha'ira, those who make some ta'til. Then we had the Mu'tazila, at-Ta'ifa al-Thaniya Mu'tazila, those who affirm the names but they reject the attributes. At-Ta'ifa al-Thalitha, this is what we looked at last week, the Karamata and the Batiniyya and the Jahmiyyah, who fell into what they fell into, where they were basically saying that Allah subhanahu, they negated everything and they only affirmed in Allah al-Wujood al-Mutlaq bi-shart al-Itlaq. This is the qa'idah that they created for themselves. We discussed that last week. Now today, At-Ta'ifa al-Rabi'ah, and today's session the Shaykh is going to talk about ghulat min al-falasifa wal-Jahmiyyah and the Karamata and Batiniyya who followed them in that. Meaning the philosophers, those people who fell into theories, those people who fell into making ideas and ideologies when it comes to the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I just want to point out one thing. When it comes to at-Tadmuriyyah, this is the taqreeb by Shaykh Muhammad bin Salih al-Uthaymeen. If you look at the contents page, if you have the Arabic, I don't think it's been translated to English, but if you look at the Arabic, the Shaykh, he gives us 5 qawaid when it comes to the names and attributes of Allah. We are now still in the first qaida, 5 principles when it comes to the names and attributes of Allah, and this is still the first one. Throughout the book, the Shaykh, he has summarized the Tadmuriyyah into 5 qawaid, and like we have said, inshallah we'll go through all of them separately. Some of the ulama have put them into 7, some of them put them into 9. Each one of them from the ulama have differed in how they want to summarize the Tadmuriyyah, but this is what you will find from the ways of the ulama, in the way that they kind of like summarize the Tadmuriyyah. The first one, so the first qa'idah, and hopefully we will try and conclude it today, because we've got this fasl where he's talking about the philosophers, right? Then the next fasl, the next chapter, he talks about a summary of everything that we have talked about before, right? So basically a recap. And then he's got another fasl, a final chapter in this first qa'idah, to drill the point even further home, where these people, and inshallah more on this will come later on, these people who say that we do not affirm either the meaning or the kayf to Allah, because this would then mean that we are resembling Allah to the creation. In the final chapter of this first qa'idah, the Shaykh brings an interesting point, which is, we as Muslims, we believe, and this is now again, I would say, prevalent in the Ummah. I mean, you speak to any Muslim, he will agree with this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described for us Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described for us the Qabr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described for us the Malaika. The example that he gives here, Na'imul Jannah, and the Ruh. But in the actual book itself, remember this is a summary, he probably gives more examples. But the point that we're making here is, when we affirm something for the creation of the unseen, we will say, okay, we affirm it, but we don't know how it is. So an angel has a face. How is the face of an angel? We don't know. Jannah has water. Is it like the water of the dunya? There's no believer who will say that it's exactly the same. Jannah has trees, Jannah has gardens, Jannah has all these different things, right? The people of Jannah, the women of Jannah, the children of Jannah, the na'im of Jannah. That's Jannah, then the qabr, and then the ruh. The Shaykh even gives another example, that your ruh is connected to your body. It leaves and it comes back. It can experience things that your body can't experience. Are you going to make ta'til of these things as well? They will say, no, we don't make ta'til of these things. So the Shaykh says in the final point here, which is that if we affirm certain things for the creation and we leave the how to Allah, then why can't we do it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? as a qaida. Right. So this is the first qaida, and the qaida that we are talking about here is essentially we affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala what He has affirmed for Himself. We do not ask in the kayf, we do not make tashbih. We affirm and we negate as it has come. We don't just leave the affirmation, and we don't just negate the negation. And some of the principles, as we will see, this is what makes up the first qaida. So now he is talking about the philosopher. And the philosopher is similar to the Jahmiyyah. The Jahmiyyah and the philosopher are really pretty much the same. I mean, I don't want to go into it right now because it'll take too long. But the Jahmiyyah, they came up, and the ulama were in total agreement that what the Jahmiyyah believed in was kufr. And anyone who fell into the same beliefs of the Jahmiyyah, some of the ulama at the time of the Salaf, they even said that they're not even from the 73 sects. Clear kufr. What happened though is that the Jahmiyyah, every time they got refuted, they came back with something which was a little bit different. And I think we did this before when we were doing Wasati and Hamawi as well. Give you an example. They said that the Quran is created, right? Imam Ahmad went through the mihna, he went through the trial, and then eventually the Aqeedah of as-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah prevailed that the Quran is not created, the speech of Allah is not created. So the Jahmiyyah, they went down again. But then what they did is they came out again with a new revised sort of Aqeedah. They said, okay, the Quran, my recitation of the Quran is created. That's what they started saying. The recitation of the Quran is created. The writing of the Quran is created. Imam Ahmad recognized this as being Jahmiyyah as well. And he said, whoever says that your recitation is created, then that person is still a Jahmi. The point that I'm making here is that the Jahmiyyah, they came and they went, they came and they went, they came and they went. And they came always with kufr, always with falsafa. What eventually happened, as mentioned by Ibn al-Jawzi in his Talbis al-Iblis, that the mutasawwifa, the people who fell into tasawwuf, etc., they took this philosophy, which started off from the philosopher, from the ancient Greeks. Then it got transferred to the Romans. And then the Jahmiyyah brought it into Islam. That is now what you find in tasawwuf today. So what we're basically saying here, that what the philosopher believe, not all the people of tasawwuf believe this, of course. Tasawwuf is an idea which has different sects within it. But one of the biggest things that we see, and the point that I'm making here, is that when we're talking about the philosopher, is that they have trickled, and they have gone and they've come back and they've revised, and it is very dangerous, their beliefs. And what we will see in this chapter is similar to what we saw in last week's chapter. And the reason why it's similar is because they keep going and coming back, keep going and coming back. That's why there's going to be repetition. And the Shaykh is saying here that the third group are the Karamata and the Batiniyyah. They first came around in the 4th century, 5th century after Hijrah. And these are the Shia, the Rawafid. These are the people who went to Makkah and Medina, and especially Makkah on the day of Mina, on the Yawm al-Tarwiyah, they started slaughtering people. And they started throwing them into the well of Zamzam. And they took the black stone with them, and they basically stole it. This is the Karamat and the Batiniyyah. This is what the Shaykh is saying here, or their beliefs in the third group that he talked about in the previous chapter. Now he's talking about the philosopher. And this is what I'm trying to say here. There isn't really that much difference, because they kind of incorporated into one another, just like the philosopher got incorporated into tasawwuf and other different nuances. الطائفة الرابع غلاة من الفلاسفة والجهمية كرامة باطنية. So that's why we see this repetition. وطريقتهم, the Shaykh is saying here, أنهم أنكروا في حق الله تعالى إثبات والنفي. They say we don't make إثبات and we don't make nafi at all. We just leave it. So they say إنه لا موجود ولا معدوم ولا حي ولا ميت ولا عالم ولا جاهل ونحو ذلك. They say we don't affirm anything and we don't negate anything. And the reason why is they say that if we make إثبات, then we're going to fall into tashbih. And if we make nafi, then we're going to make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into ma'doom, or shabahu bil ma'doomat. Either if we're going to negate. So for example, if you say that Allah doesn't die, if you say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't forget, وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ نَسِيًّا, If you say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't oppress, وَمَا رَبُّكَ بِذَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ, these are found with Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah as negation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or from the hadith from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which are authentic. So we'll make those negations because those are found in the text. But what they say is that if you're going to make those negations, then it basically necessitates that you are making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into something which doesn't exist, or you are resembling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into something that doesn't exist. So the Philosophers, they say that Allah exists, but we don't know. And this is what you will find even in English circles now, English speaking circles, shall I say. Some of them say that Allah exists without a place. I don't know if you've heard this before. Some of them say that Allah exists without a place. So what they will say, He's not everywhere, but He's not above His arsh either. So they are not affirming this, so they're not negating that. They will say Allah exists, but we don't know it. And this is similar to what the Philosophers believe. One of the reasons why the people of philosophy and philosopher and the ancient Greeks fell into this is because they couldn't define what ilm is. They couldn't define what ilm is. And I think we did this when we were doing Hamawiyah last time, where the Philosophers, they actually believe that revelation cannot actually be proven, but it is a concept which can actually be accepted. So they basically say, if you're saying that you've got a pious person and the Creator reveals revelation to him, so that revelation is then passed on to others, that is possible. They say, of course, that is possible. How do you prove that? We can't prove it. This is because the people of Kalam and philosophy have differed amongst themselves as to what is ilm in the first place. So some of them even say, and this is what Ibn Sina and others fell into, and this is why we've got a fourth category, because it's not exactly the same as the Jahmi and the Karamat and the Bataniyah, is that they basically said, well, there is no haqq, la mawjood illallah. There is no haqq illallah. So they ended up believing in something which is known as hulul, because this is what the Philosophers believed in. Because they say, I don't know if you exist, and I don't know if you exist, and I don't know if I exist, and I don't know if this microphone exists, I don't know if this table exists. I can't prove any of these things. So they say, as Muslims, that we know that Allah exists, therefore everything is Allah. This is hulul. The Philosophers, they said it from a different aspect, not from an Islamic point of view. They said, we don't know if anything exists. We can't prove it. Maybe it's all a dream. Maybe this reality is not real. And this is why they are saying this. They will say, from the people of philosophy, not all of them, some of them, they will say, okay, we believe in a creator. How do we understand who that creator is? Well, we can't. How do we know what we're going to affirm for him? How do we know what we're going to negate for him? They'll say we can't. And this goes back to what we were saying, what is ilm and what is revelation. From the arguments, they said, okay, we can't resemble him to the creation because he is the creator, and we can't resemble him to things which don't exist because that is not possible for the creator to resemble things which don't exist. This is the philosophy that they're coming up with. Again, this is batil. Again, this is wrong, and this is what the Shaykh is saying here. وَرَدُّ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ وُجُوهٍ. And the Shaykh now will give us responses to them, and he gives us 4 responses to them. And as we have seen from the previous chapters, he has a number of responses, but some of them, I think, they overlap. The first thing that we can say that this isn't from the Kitab and the Sunnah and the understanding of Salaf Salih, but the Shaykh hasn't mentioned that because all of that has already been previously mentioned anyway. So he says, Al-Awwal, the first response to أن تسمية الله ووصفه بما سمى وصفه بنفسه ليس تشبيه ولا يلتزم التشبيه. Similar to what we have said before. If you are going to affirm something for Allah, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are making a resemblance to Allah, to that thing that you are affirming for Him, to the creation. فَنِلْ الْإِشْتِرَاكِ, because those things which are similar, Allah has a face, we have a face. Allah has hands, we have. فِي الْإِسْمِ وَالصِّفَةِ لَا يَسْتَلْزِمْ تَمَاثُلْ. If you're given a name to Allah, if you're given an attribute to Allah, it doesn't mean that we are resembling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the creation. So now, the Shaykh basically is saying here is that their ideas and their philosophy and their kalam has come from things which are just made up. وَتَسْمِيَتُكُمْ ذَلِكَ تَشْبِيهًا لَيْسَ إِلَّا تَمْوِيهًا وَتَلْبِيسًا الْعَامَ وَالْجُهَّالِ. That you have made these things up and you are using these things, and this is very important, what the Shaykh is saying here. I mean, I'm not sure if this is happening so much now, but I would definitely say within the last decade, a lot of the youth have been attracted towards debating and looking at philosophy and theory and all these different things in trying to prove Allah and disprove other religions, etc. The Shaykh is saying here Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah is an expert in philosophy himself. He's an expert in Kalam and al-Mantiq. He is saying here, now this is very important, he is saying here, you have made up these principles. You come out with all these different terminologies, not because there's any reality to it. You are doing it to make yourself seem clever, and you're doing them to make it confusing for the general masses. So if you've got this professor, and this is what's happening now, you've got these professors, you've got these doctors, they're using all these different theories, all this, lavish and extravagant language, where normal people who haven't studied these kind of things makes them feel inferior to what he is actually saying. But the Shaykh is basically saying here, Ibn Taymiyyah, you're using all of these different terminologies and all of these principles that you have made up, but in essence, there is no substance to it. Absolutely shallow and hollow. وَقُلُوبُنَا مِثْلَ هَذِي الدَّعْوَةِ الْبَاطِلَةِ لأمكن كل مبطل أن يسمى الشيء الحق بأسماء ينفر به الناس عن قبوله. The Shaykh goes on to say, how do we know that this is wrong? Not only from the sam' but also from the aql and also from the hiss and the fitrah. You are coming out, the people of Kalam, you are coming out with all this da'wah al-batila. لأمكن كل مبطل. You are using all this philosophy and all this batil, and you are making it into a package which makes it seem that it's acceptable, but even the people, when they hear it, it doesn't sit with them. It doesn't sit. So that's the first thing that the Shaykh is saying here, that they have fallen into this error because they have rejected the haqq and they have made up these principles themselves. الثاني, the second way that we can respond to the philosopher, أنه قد علم بالضرورة العقل والحس أن الموجود الممكن لا بد له من موجود واجب al-Wujood. The Shaykh is saying here that we can tell from our aql, our hiss, our fitrah, that those things which it is possible for those things to exist, then they are going to have attributes and they're going to be given attributes for those things when they exist. So for example, when a human being exists, it's going to be given those attributes. Therefore, the Shaykh is saying here, if you've got something which is wujood, and this is similar to what we've said also before, something which is mawjood, or something which brings about existence, who is the Creator subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is not possible that that Creator exists without attributes. Hence Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمْ خَالِقُونَ. Were you created from nothing, or are you yourselves the Creator? The Shaykh is using this ayah to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Khaliq, Wajib al-Mawjood, wa huwa Allah ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Creator. He has always existed. Because of that, the creation came about. Therefore, there is a connection between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existing, His attributes, and then our existence. And this is the ayah. Because we weren't created from nothing and we didn't create ourselves. So what created us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. That then instills in, like the Shaykh is saying here, قَدْ عُلِمَ بِالضَّرُورِ الْعَقْلِ وَالْحِسِّ, in our aql, in our hiss, in our senses, in our fitrah, that we know now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. With this then, the Shaykh is saying, we learn two other things to refute them. Number one, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed and He's got attributes, then that then basically means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has attributes which are always attributed to Him. Now this is a discussion we don't want to get into right now, but the people of Kalam and those people who fell into Kalam, the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, etc., was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these names and attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, were they always a description of Allah or not? The people of Kalam say, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only became the Khaliq when He created. He only became the Raziq when He decreed rizq, etc. Whereas what the Shaykh is saying here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed as aliyun, wajib al-wujub bi nafsihi, that He existed in His that always, And an extension from that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had these attributes always. The second thing that the Shaykh gets from this ayah and this principle here as well is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because here now we're talking about atheism as well really, we're talking about what is the beginning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always existed. This is now known as the Wajib al-Wujood. The creator has to exist in order for everything else to come about. From this, the Shaykh is saying here is that everything that came after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that He is going to create the creation, all of that is Mumkin al-Wujood, meaning it is possible for it to exist, but it is not something which is wajib. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me and you. Abdullah, who doesn't exist, is it possible that Allah creates Abdullah? Yes, it is possible. Is it possible that Allah doesn't create Abdullah? Yes, it's also possible. So this is what the Shaykh is saying here, which is that the people of Kalam and the people of philosophy, they said that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, but we don't affirm for Him anything, we don't negate for Him anything, it denies this point here, which is that we've got the Wajib al-Wujood, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, and then from His attributes with the ithbat and the nafi, which is that everything else is mumkin. Everything else is mumkin. And this is now connected to whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates it or doesn't create it. And then the Shaykh says that this is well known and in our aql, and if a person was to reject this, وَكِلَاهُمَا مَعْلُومٌ فَسَادٌ بِالِاتِّرَارِ, that if a person was to reject this, then in the consequences of what we have just said, then that will necessitate fasad bil-ittirar. There is no doubt that this person's aqeedah will then be corrupted. The third way, أن إنكارهم الإثبات والنفي, that they reject that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has affirmation, and they reject that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has negation. يستلزم نفي النقيضين معا وهذا ممتنع. If we are going to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no ithbat, if we're going to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no nafi, no negation, then they contradict one another. They nullify one another. They cancel one another. So the Shaykh, for example, says, can we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mawjood? The answer is yes. But then can we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not mawjood? Then we will say, no, Allah is not mawjood, meaning He is mawjood. What they say is, He is not mawjood and He is not adam. So now, if they are not going to have ithbat and nafi, then you are contradicting yourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they will say, because they are not affirming and they are not negating. Remember, this is what we are trying to tackle here. They will say Allah is not hay and Allah is not mayyit. So if you're going to say He's not hay and He's not mayyit, then what is He? Because these two have cancelled each other out. So you have to have the ithbat and the nafi, otherwise you're going to end up nullifying one another, and that is then not going to affirm perfection for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِن قَالُوا, but if they say that these two things which negate one another, doesn't always have to be the case. So this is how they will fall into ilm al-kalam. This table here. This table, is it alive? It's not alive. Is the table dead? It is not dead. So the people of kalam will say, okay, look, you are saying that we are contradicting each other. We've got an example of something here which isn't alive and which isn't dead. Therefore, there is no contradiction. So then why can't we attribute that to Allah? This is what they will say. The Shaykh responds by saying, number one, this is false and it is not correct because of the fact that when it comes to resembling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to those things, to the jamadat, to those things which don't have the same attributes, it's not possible. It is rejected by the text, it is rejected by the aql, it is rejected by the hiss, and this qiyas, this analogy where they will have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala they will often use it to make a qiyas with trees and mountains and things like that. This qiyas is not correct, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-hayy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, and you are connecting it, the qiyas that you are making, to the creation when it comes to the attributes. That's the first thing. The second thing is that what they are actually doing is they are negating for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the same time, despite the fact that they are saying that they are not negating. So they will say, for example, Allah is not alive and He is not dead. So then what is the conclusion? They will say, we are negating, we don't know. So the conclusion will always be the thing that they are trying to run away from. A third response that he gives, and this is actually very, very good as well, in the sense that when they don't affirm and when they don't negate, there is no end result which leaves perfection for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, if you were to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like this table, na'udhu billah, He is not alive, He is not dead, He is not this, and He is not that, what are you reducing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to? You see that point there? So this is what the Shaykh is saying here as well, is that when they come out with this principle and they use this philosophy in this way, they are using these false ideologies which ends up in what they think is perfection when it actually isn't. Al-Wajh al-Thalith. I think I'm just trying not to repeat myself, because here on these 2 pages, I think a lot of the things that we've said have been summarized in what I've just said. So the third one, he says that affirmation and negation is actually more perfection. So when we affirm ilm and qudra and sam and basar and all of these other things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has attributed for Himself, all of this leaves perfection for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you balance it with the affirmation and the negation. And then the fourth thing that the Shaykh says in response to what these people are saying, that we are not resembling Allah to the creation, etc., is that they say that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists and we don't affirm for Him and we don't negate for Him, then in essence what they are doing is that they are making tashbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the worst possible way, like we've just said here, which is that they are resembling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the ma'dumat, which is in a way even worse to resembling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the creation. And this is what Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said here on page 37. Then the Shaykh says, Faslun. Should we continue or should we stop? So in the next fasl now, he is actually giving us a summary of all the principles of what we have kind of established before. Should we stop here? Next week. Khalas, inshallah. So now in the next fasl, he is going to talk about, like we have said, a summary of all the different things that we have mentioned before, and a summary of the different deviances that exist and the responses towards them over the next 3 or 4 pages. Bi'awnillah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He keeps us firm upon the sirat al-mustaqim until we meet Him. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه.